There's a particular kind of silence that lives in a man who has never learned to speak with his whole body. And if you've felt it, you know exactly what I mean. The moment arrives when something is needed from you. Action, decision, protection, clarity. And instead of rising to meet it, something inside you goes quiet. But not the quiet of calm, the quiet of absence. You're standing there watching the moment pass, and later when you're alone, you'll replay it over and over. The words you didn't say, the boundary you didn't hold, the risk you didn't take. And there's a specific flavour to this regret that's not just about what you did or didn't do, but about who you weren't able to be. This isn't about muscles or machismo, or some theatrical version of manhood you're supposed to perform for an audience. What we're talking about is deeper, quieter, and far more essential than any of that. Psychologists call them capacities, the internal structures that allow you to move through the world with agency, to protect what matters, to build something real, to stand firm when standing firm is what's needed. When these capacities remain underdeveloped, when they never quite form in you, you don't become less of a man in some abstract cultural sense. You become less of yourself, and the architecture of your inner world has rooms that were never finished and foundations that were never poured. You can feel it in your body sometimes, the way your chest constricts when conflict arrives, the way your voice loses its ground, the way you disappear into agreeableness and invisibility through a kind of psychic hiding that you've perfected over years without even knowing you were doing it. Fear lives there. But it's not fear exactly. It's more like a developmental gap. A place where something was supposed to grow but didn't, and now you're trying to navigate a world that assumes you have tools you never received. The strange thing's how normal it feels when you look around and see other men moving through their lives with a certain kind of centered force. And you think, maybe that's just who they are. Like some men have it and some don't. What you're seeing isn't genetic lottery though. It's the difference between developed and underdeveloped masculine psychology. And the gap between those two states is almost invisible from the outside. But from the inside, it's the difference between living and haunting your own life. There's a particular loneliness to this that most people never talk about. The culture right now doesn't quite know how to talk about masculine development without either celebrating toxic extremes or pretending that masculine traits don't exist at all, which leaves you in this strange void, sensing that something essential is missing, but having no language for it. No map, no permission to even name the absence without someone misunderstanding what you mean. So you adapt and become functional and learn to move through the world by avoiding the situations that would expose the gap. You choose relationships where you won't be challenged, select careers where decisive action isn't required, build a life around what you can do, and you barely notice that you're unconsciously designing everything to avoid what you can't. The underdeveloped parts of you don't announce themselves with fanfare. They just quietly shape every choice you make, every door you don't walk through, every version of yourself you never become. But here's what's true, what's always been true, even if no one said it clearly enough for you to hear. Masculine traits aren't about gender performance at all. They're about psychological capacities that every person needs in some form. The ability to act decisively, to hold boundaries that matter, to move toward challenge rather than away from it, to protect and provide in the deepest sense of those words. Lose access to these capacities, and you don't just fail at some cultural script. You lose access to parts of your own aliveness and become a spectator in moments that needed you to be a participant. Somewhere deep down you know this. You've always known it. There's a part of you that recognizes the shape of what's missing, even if you can't name it. And you see it in the way you defer, in the way you collapse inward, when the moment asks you to expand. You feel it in the quiet shame that arrives after you've shrunk again, after you've let another moment slip by where you could have been more present, more clear, more real. This isn't your fault. And that needs to be said first before we go any deeper into this. Whatever didn't develop in you, whatever masculine capacities remained dormant, they didn't fail to grow because you were weak or broken or fundamentally flawed. They didn't grow because somewhere in your development, the conditions weren't right. The modelling wasn't there. The safety wasn't there. The encouragement wasn't there. Something essential was missing in the environment, and a part of you stopped growing, went underground, learned to survive by staying small. But here's the other truth, the one that matters just as much. Underdeveloped doesn't mean unreachable. The capacities that didn't form when they were supposed to can still form now, not easily and not without discomfort. But the architecture of masculine psychology isn't fixed at 18 or 25 or 40. It's fluid, responsive, alive. The moment you start to see what's missing, the moment you begin to understand the shape of your own underdevelopment, something shifts. Not everything and not overnight, but something. Every underdeveloped masculine trait has an origin story, even if you don't remember it anymore. Somewhere in your early years, in the thousand small interactions that formed you, there were moments when you reached for agency and found nothing there to meet you. Moments when you tried to assert yourself and were met with ridicule or punishment, or a terrifying kind of silence that taught you it wasn't safe to be that visible, that decisive, that clear. Your father might have been absent, and in that absence you learned that masculine presence was unreliable, something that disappears when you need it most. Or maybe he was there but fragile, and you learned to make yourself small so you wouldn't threaten him or expose his own underdevelopment. Maybe he was domineering instead, and you learned that masculine force only comes in one flavour, crushing and overwhelming. So you rejected it entirely, and threw out the capacity for healthy assertion along with the toxicity you didn't want to become. Or perhaps your mother was the strongest presence in your world, and without meaning to, she taught you that masculine traits were dangerous and unnecessary, something to be softened and controlled. What she needed was for you to be gentle, compliant, emotionally available in ways that required you to abandon other parts of yourself, and you became the good boy, the sensitive one. While no one told you that sensitivity and strength weren't opposites, that you could hold both. Attachment theory tells us something worth understanding here. The way you learn to be safe in your earliest relationships becomes the blueprint for how you move through the entire world. If you discovered that your needs were met when you stayed small, when you didn't ask for too much, when you accommodated rather than asserted, that pattern doesn't just live in your relationship with your parents. It becomes the unconscious template for every interaction. You bring that same psychic posture to your career, your friendships, your intimate relationships, still trying to be safe by staying invisible, by not taking up space, by not activating the masculine capacities that once felt dangerous to express. And that's when modern culture creates a kind of learned helplessness in men that nobody wants to acknowledge. You grew up in a world that was simultaneously telling you that masculine traits were toxic, and that you should somehow still have them when the moment demanded it, and you internalized a deep confusion. Be strong but not aggressive. Be confident but not arrogant. Be decisive but not domineering. The margins were so thin, and the possibility of getting it wrong so humiliating that the safest move seemed to be not to try at all, to let someone else lead, let someone else decide, stay in the background where you can't be judged for doing masculinity wrong. But here's what nobody told you about the neurobiology of assertiveness, of healthy aggression, of directed action. It develops through practice, through failure, through the repeated experience of taking up space and discovering that the world doesn't collapse. When you never get that practice, when you spend your developmental years in a state of psychic holding back, the neural pathways for assertive action simply don't form the way they should. And this isn't metaphorical. Your brain literally organizes itself around avoidance, around the suppression of the impulse to act. Once that pattern is established, shame becomes the guardian at the gate. Now, when you do try to assert yourself, when you attempt to access those dormant capacities, it feels unnatural and performative and false. And you can feel how unpracticed you are, how the movements of masculine agency don't flow from you the way they seem to flow from other men. That awkwardness triggers shame, which makes you retreat, which deepens the underdevelopment, which creates more shame, and the cycle tightens around you. There's a distinction here that gets lost in most conversations about masculinity. The difference between suppression and underdevelopment. Suppression is when you have the capacity, but you're actively holding it back. There's a pressure there, an energy being contained, and you can feel the force of what you're not expressing. Underdevelopment is quieter and stranger because it's the absence of pressure. There's nothing being held back because nothing fully formed in the first place. You're not restraining your assertiveness. you're discovering that when you reach for it, there's less there than there should be. And that's why the usual advice doesn't land when people tell you to just be more confident, to speak up, to take action. It bounces off because they're speaking to a version of you that has the capacity but isn't using it. And they don't understand that you're not holding yourself back. You're genuinely unsure how to move forward because the internal structure that would allow that movement never fully developed. Think about the boy who was punished every time he showed anger, who learned that his aggression, even the healthy kind, the kind that says no and means it, was unacceptable. He doesn't grow into a man who has anger but chooses not to express it. He grows into a man who has a collapsed relationship with his own force, who literally doesn't know how to access the energy that would allow him to defend himself, to push back, to stand his ground. When he needs that capacity, he reaches inside and finds fog. Or think about the boy who was never allowed to fail, whose parents smoothed every obstacle out of his path, who never had to develop resilience through struggle. He doesn't become a man who could handle hardship, but chooses ease. He becomes a man whose entire nervous system is organized around avoiding discomfort, whose psychology never built the musculature to tolerate challenge. And his avoidance isn't weakness. It's the predictable result of a developmental environment that never required him to be strong. And here's the deepest truth, the one that's hardest to accept about all of this. Your underdevelopment isn't a personal failure at all. It's a developmental response to your environment, and you adapted to the conditions you were given, survived by not developing the parts of yourself that felt dangerous to express. The boy you were made the best choices he could with the information he had, and protected you by keeping those capacities dormant. And he didn't know that one day you'd need them, that the very traits you learnt to suppress or never develop would become essential to living a full life. But now you're here, carrying the consequences of adaptations that once kept you safe but now keep you small. And the first step toward development isn't shame or self-blame, or forcing yourself to be different. It's recognition, seeing clearly for maybe the first time exactly what didn't grow, and why, and what that absence has cost you. The cost reveals itself slowly, in ways you don't connect at first. You're in a relationship and there's a pattern you can't quite name. Your partner seems frustrated with you, but when you ask what's wrong, they struggle to articulate it. They say things like, "I need you to be more present," or "I wish you'd just take charge sometimes." And you genuinely don't understand what they mean because you are present and you do help. But there's something they're asking for that you can't quite access. And the confusion between you grows into a distance neither of you intended. What they're feeling, though they might not have the language for it either, is the absence of your masculine core. They're sensing the places where you defer when you shouldn't defer, where you seek their approval instead of trusting your own judgment, where you collapse under pressure instead of becoming more solid. And it's not that they want you to dominate or control, they want to feel you, steady and clear and capable of holding space even when things are uncertain. When that capacity isn't there, when your uncertainty becomes the emotional climate of the relationship, something in them begins to lose attraction and begins to close. This is the part that hurts to acknowledge because you're trying so hard. You're kind and considerate, and doing everything you thought you were supposed to do. But kindness without groundedness becomes a kind of appeasing energy, and consideration without clarity becomes an inability to hold boundaries. The relationship doesn't die from your cruelty, it dies from your collapse, from the way you can't quite show up as an equal force, a matching presence, and you become someone to take care of rather than someone to lean on. And that shift changes everything. And it's not just romantic relationships. This pattern lives everywhere in your life. At work, you watch opportunities pass to people who aren't more qualified but who are more willing to assert themselves, to take up space, to speak with conviction even when they're uncertain. You have good ideas but they stay inside you, or you present them so tentatively that no one takes them seriously, and you wait for permission that never comes because the world doesn't give permission. It responds to people who act as if they already have it. You tell yourself you're being humble and thoughtful and collaborative. And maybe you are. But underneath those virtues, there's also fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of being challenged, fear of taking up the space that taking action requires. So you stay in roles where you won't be tested too much, where you can remain competent within a narrow range. Part of you knows even if you never say it aloud, that you're living smaller than you could be, that you're organizing your entire professional life around what you can't do rather than stretching toward what you might become. The internal cost is harder to see, but heavier to carry, and there's a particular kind of depression that comes with chronic underdevelopment. Not the acute darkness of trauma, but a low-grade emptiness, a sense that you're moving through your life without quite inhabiting it. You're functional and responsible and mostly fine, but there's no fire in you, no sense of purpose that feels authored by your own desire rather than adopted from what you think you should want. Anxiety becomes your constant companion, but it's not the anxiety of too much. It's the anxiety of not enough. The gnawing sense that you're unprepared for the demands of your own life, that at any moment the world will ask something of you that you can't provide. And you lie awake at night, not thinking about what you did wrong, but about what you failed to do. The conversation where you didn't speak up, the opportunity you didn't pursue, the moment you let pass, because stepping into it felt like stepping off a cliff, and your body tells the truth even when your mind tries to manage the story. The chronic tension in your shoulders, the shallow breathing, the exhaustion that comes not from overwork, but from the constant effort of holding yourself back. Your nervous system is locked in a perpetual state of low-level threat response, not because danger is present, but because you don't trust yourself to handle it if it arrives. You've learnt to live braced and contracted, always slightly prepared to disappear. There's a cascade effect here that's worth understanding, because when one masculine capacity remains underdeveloped, it affects the entire system. Let's say you never learnt healthy assertiveness. That absence doesn't stay contained. It means you can't set boundaries, which means your relationships become draining, which means you withdraw, which means you become isolated, which deepens your anxiety, which makes asserting yourself feel even more impossible. One underdeveloped trait becomes the foundation for a life shaped around limitation. And that's when we have to look at the statistics we don't talk about enough, the ones that reveal the depth of this crisis. 3 out of every 4 suicides are men. Male loneliness has reached epidemic levels, and depression in men is chronically underdiagnosed because it manifests not as sadness, but as irritability, withdrawal, numbness. When you look closer at what's underneath those numbers, you find the same pattern. Men who feel fundamentally incapable, who have lost access to the sense of agency and purpose that makes life feel worth living. This isn't abstract theory or academic discussion. These are the stakes. When masculine capacities remain underdeveloped, the cost isn't just missed opportunities or unsatisfying relationships. The cost is your life force itself. The vitality that comes from feeling capable of meeting the world, of building something that matters, of standing for something real. Without that, existence becomes a kind of endurance where you're just trying to make it through without causing problems, without being exposed, without having to reveal how uncertain you feel about everything. And the cruelest part is how invisible this suffering is. You don't talk about it because the culture has no real container for masculine vulnerability that isn't framed as either weakness or toxic behavior. So you suffer quietly, thinking you're the only one, thinking there's something uniquely broken in you. You watch other men who seem fine, who seem capable, and you assume they don't carry this same weight. But they do. So many of them do. The underdevelopment of masculine psychology isn't an individual problem. It's a collective wound. A generation of men who were never taught how to become who they needed to be. But seeing the cost clearly, feeling the full weight of what underdevelopment has taken from you, this isn't where the story ends. It's where the real work begins. The path forward doesn't begin with fixing yourself. It begins with something subtler, something the self-help world rarely mentions: grief. Before you can develop what was never there, you have to acknowledge what you lost. The boyhood that could have taught you differently, the father or mentor who could have modelled masculine presence, the thousands of small moments when you could have learned to trust your own force, your own clarity, your own capacity to meet the world head-on. You have to let yourself feel that loss. Not to dwell in it or build an identity around it, but to honour what's true. Something was supposed to happen in your development that didn't happen. You were supposed to receive something you didn't receive, and pretending that absence doesn't matter. Pushing forward with forced positivity only deepens the wound. The grief itself is part of the healing because it's the acknowledgement that something real was missing. And that missing piece shaped your entire life. But here's where it gets interesting. Once you've touched that grief, once you've stopped pretending you don't carry it, a strange kind of freedom emerges. You're no longer trying to hide the underdevelopment or perform competence you don't feel, and you can look clearly at what's actually there and what's actually missing. From that clarity, real development becomes possible. Psychologists sometimes talk about reparenting, the idea that you can give yourself now what you didn't receive then. And it sounds abstract, but in practice it means something very specific. You consciously and deliberately create the conditions that allow dormant capacities to develop. You become your own patient teacher. Give yourself permission to be clumsy and unpracticed and uncertain. And you practice the movements of assertiveness, of boundary setting, of decisive action. Not because you're good at them, but precisely because you're not. This doesn't happen in one transformative moment. It happens in the smallest choices. The meeting where you speak up, even though your voice shakes. The relationship conversation where you name what you need, instead of accommodating what the other person wants, the decision you make without seeking approval first. And each of these moments is tiny, almost invisible. But each one is building neural pathways that didn't exist before. You're literally growing new psychological muscle. And like any muscle, it grows through use, through the controlled discomfort of progressive challenge. And you need other men, not to compare yourself to them or compete with them, but to witness and be witnessed. There's something that happens when men come together without pretense. When they stop performing and start revealing, the facades drop, and underneath everyone is carrying some version of the same uncertainty, the same sense of not knowing if they're enough. That recognition doesn't solve anything by itself, but it breaks the isolation that makes underdevelopment feel like personal failure, and you see that what you carry is part of a larger pattern, which somehow makes it easier to work with. Mentorship matters too, though not in the hierarchical way you might think. You're not looking for someone to tell you how to be a man, you're looking for someone a few steps ahead, who can reflect back your own capacity, who can see the masculine core in you that you can't quite see yourself yet. Someone who won't do the work for you, but who will hold steady while you do it. Who won't collapse when you falter. Who believes in your potential, even when you don't. The deepest truth about this entire process is that development requires discomfort. And the reason these capacities didn't develop in the first place is that developing them felt unsafe, threatening, impossible. They still do, and every time you move toward the edge of your capacity, every time you try to access a masculine trait that's been dormant, your entire nervous system will resist. You'll feel exposed and fraudulent and terrified, and that's exactly how you know you're in the right place. But this isn't about becoming someone else, and that's what you need to understand. You're not trying to adopt some external image of masculinity or perform what a developed man is supposed to look like. You're excavating what's already there, dormant but real. You're removing the layers of adaptation and defense that buried your essential force, and the masculinity you're developing isn't borrowed. It's yours. It was always yours. It just never had permission to breathe. And as it begins to breathe, as these capacities slowly come online, you'll notice changes that aren't dramatic but that change everything. You'll stand differently in your body, speak with less apology in your voice, make decisions without spiraling into doubt. Set a boundary and feel it hold. Small things, quiet things. But the sum of them is a life that feels increasingly like yours, a sense of self that has weight and ground and presence. This is what integration means, not fixing the broken parts or becoming someone new, but allowing all of you to exist at once. The sensitivity and the strength, the gentleness and the force, the capacity to nurture and the capacity to protect. The underdeveloped traits don't need to replace what's already working. They need to join it to complete the picture of who you actually are. And maybe that's the ultimate truth here. You were never supposed to be one thing. The masculine psychology you're developing isn't about narrowing yourself into some rigid ideal. It's about expanding into fullness, becoming capable of the full range of human response, soft when softness serves, strong when strength is needed, flexible enough to meet life as it actually arrives rather than as you wish it would. The work is slow and the work is uncomfortable, but the work is yours. Every small act of development, every moment you choose to show up as more than you've been is an act of reclaiming your own life.